does it just sort of fall into by the wayside? The Americans gradually do get pulled more to the Indo-Pacific as the Chinese ramp up the temperature on the Taiwanese, and ultimately the Ukrainians have to sort of develop their own industries and do what they can to minimize losses of territories. The Russians maybe just grind away incrementally.
It's a dynamic stalemate. The battle lines move back and forth, but that neither side is really going to be capable of delivering a kind of political knockout blow to the other. We're not going to see Russian tanks rolling into Kyiv. We're certainly not going to see Ukrainian tanks rolling into Moscow. I think they will reach a point where, like two punch-drunk boxers hanging on the ropes, basically rebuild their forces. And we spend a lot of time thinking about the potential timeline for the Russians reconstituting their forces, which frankly is going to take, in my opinion, at least 8 years after the end of the active warfighting stage.
This is the Global Gambit.
Ukraine wants to join NATO. I have my reservations about the practical application of that, the reality of that, not because I don't want the country to be an independent sovereign state, but because the country is, well, we can use Bosnia as a case study, right? They've been going through the, the integrated map, I think is the short, I forget the name for the process that you have to go through. And they've been in that since, 2006, 7? And that's because they're not economically there yet. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of political, institutional restructuring that needs to happen. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, right? And Ukraine, unfortunately, does have a few of those things to tackle. So attached to that is, well, that's a question in itself. Do you think there's a reasonability there? But second, when Putin first started this full-scale SMO, i.e. war, let's not beat around the bush, I always felt that he wanted to go and create a sort of Belarus 2.0. He wanted to not take all of Ukraine physically, people seem to misunderstand that bit, but obviously control key areas and force the removal of Zelensky and install, a Lukashenko version. And because that didn't go the way he wanted it, he started focusing on the Novorossiya scenario, take all the Russian imperialistic territories and just make Ukraine a rump state. What's your assessment on that? Is that in any way accurate, or it doesn't really matter in the larger scheme of things?
I think it matters, and I think it's accurate. There you go. It's nice to actually be able to give a short answer. Yeah, I mean, this is it. He was never looking at trying to kind of bring Lviv into the Russian Federation. It's about sphere of influence. I mean, I think there's two things here. Yeah, I promised a short answer, but now I
know you did. Switch. You're going to go off. Going off in your deep dive. I want to hear it.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we've got to understand is Putin is a very 19th century geopolitician who basically sees the world as divided between those countries that, to put it crudely, give orders and those countries that take orders. It's kind of a fairly colonial sort of notion, and he's obviously determined that Russia is one of the former, but also. He believes that a great power has a sphere of influence. And I think his view is that, look, southeastern Ukraine is not really Ukraine. It's just a part of Russia, which through various administrative reasons, particularly by those damn Bolsheviks and Lenin, who is the sort of the great demon in all of this for creating a Ukrainian SSR, Soviet Socialist Republic. So the Donbass, the Novorossiya area, that actually is really Russia. The rest is not, but nonetheless, it is part of Russia's historical, cultural patrimony and its political sphere of influence. So yes, absolutely. So, what he wanted was basically, at first, just, Ukraine knowing its place. And then if that doesn't happen, well, he'll take the southeast and still hope that he can ensure that the rest of Ukraine is at the very least politically neutralized. If he can't have it as a vassal state, it can't be a part of NATO. So we're into the realms of Finlandizations.
Yeah, no, that's what I was wondering, this whole idea of neutrality and whether Ukraine was going to be, but I think people seem to forget that Ukraine was willing to be neutral in 2010 and stuff, and then, well, Russia did what it did with Crimea. But Yeah, I mean, I think the Novorossiya scenario kind of covers a lot of bases. It takes back the historical Russian protection identity thing. It covers a lot of strategical significant land in the form of eastern Ukraine and a lot of the resources down there. Cuts off Ukraine from the Black Sea, gives Russia unprecedented control. Obviously, means Sevastopol is fine, and plays into that also just a ideological element of him, I think. But just do you think Ukraine should be in NATO, or rephrased, do you think they can be, pragmatically speaking?
Um, yeah, I mean, look,
I like where
there
you are
is
with that
no
question.
great enthusiasm for Ukraine in NATO, in within existing NATO countries. Everyone says the right thing, but there's such a discrepancy between the rhetoric and the reality on so many different issues. We hide behind all these mantras about everything, whatever Ukraine needs, as long as it takes, so forth. And certainly on NATO, yes, there are certain countries, Poland, Baltic states, which do seem to be inclining, but it has to be a consensus decision. And in the main, NATO does not really want Ukraine, is the depressing truth of the matter. However, if we want some kind of peace, then I think it's going to be very hard not to have Ukraine in NATO. Because, look, especially if there's going to be a land for peace deal, which, is at the moment antithetical to official Ukrainian policy, but may well end up being the only way this war can be ended. Well, Ukraine will expect to have serious security guarantees. And look, security guarantees depend on credibility. And I think as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, and I think quite rightly, it's only really NATO's Article 5 guarantee that actually has real weight in Russia. If Germany says, sure, we'll come to war if you're invaded, will the Russians really believe that? If the French say it, if the British say that, even maybe if there's a bilateral American thing, because America may well be busy. I think so. Given that the importance is actually the credibility of any kind of security guarantees, I can imagine an eventual negotiation process, whenever that does happen, of when the West goes into it, because the West will be part of that process inevitably. They will go into it absolutely determined not to let Ukraine into NATO, but they may well emerge from it having had to accept that Ukraine will become fast-tracked. And ironically, thanks to Putin's war, Ukraine may well get that VIP lane that Putin was demanding for Russia, because obviously it will have to be done as sort of quickly as possible. It may be that they can find other ways of guaranteeing Ukrainian security, because the fact of part of your territory being occupied by another country is not an absolute obstacle. West Germany managed it. There are all kinds of ways round it. But first of all, there has to be a ceasefire. Secondly, there has to be some kind of credible sense that the ceasefire will last, and a clear sense of a demarcated boundary. That is the point at which NATO is willing to defend. Because you can't just simply say, we'll defend you if there's trouble somewhere over there. You actually have to be able to say, at this point, Russian troops crossed into Ukrainian territory. But more to the point, there has to be a will to provide a serious security guarantee. Because otherwise, Ukraine is either A, going to become, as Zelensky put it, a big Israel, a massively militarized state, increasingly sort of flirting with martial law in order to get the resources it needs. Or, and this is kind of longer term, but if I was sitting in Kyiv and I was thinking, okay, how can we really guarantee our long-term security against Russia? About the only way I could really say it, if we don't have foreign assistance, is a nuclear program.
Yep. Yeah, I was about to.
And I don't think we want that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Kremlinites like to point out is that the symbolic significance of Ukraine to this part of the world, to Russia, and that in the long term, I'm just going to be blunt and say it, that sort of America won't give a shit about Ukraine when this war is done or it's much more subsided. The Americans would have moved on to the Indo-Pacific because that's where their systemic risk and threat lies, i.e. the Chinese. or the CCP more specifically. Let's be honest. I don't want to come across xenophobic, but it's not. It's not a. Is that just a talking point of theirs, or is this really that US does sort of leverage Ukraine a little bit as a pawn in the great geopolitical chess game? Or is that too harsh?
I think that is too harsh. I mean, it's not often that I come forth as the sort of defender of the poor, beleaguered United States. But I mean, I think that actually the United States is not really regarding this as a great advantage, frankly. Those people who say, oh, it's greatly cost effective because essentially, thanks to the Ukrainians, we are degrading Russia's military capabilities. I think that's a kind of a populist line. I don't get any sense that that's got serious traction within American policy circles. I think this is much more about the fact that they just can't. They can't allow this to happen. But certainly at this point, they're stuck, frankly. If they withdraw from support for Ukraine, as indeed Donald Trump might, nonetheless, there will be a massive blow to American credibility in Europe, in the world, and frankly, America can afford this in the sense of, it's not just American money that is being spent on weapons. It's a lot of European money, and a lot of those weapons are actually made in the American heartland. And also the whole attempt to orient away from Russian energy in Europe has also meant a boom for American liquid natural LNG, liquid natural gas. So, I think from their point of view, I don't think it's a purely cynical move to use Ukraine against the Russians the way absolutely Putin's propagandists claim. The big thing, though, is when the shooting ends. I mean, not just a sort of momentary ceasefire, but when it does look as if actually that's happening, then America almost certainly will pivot away, and it will expect Europe to be picking up much more of the shortfall there, because at the moment, Europe could be spending a lot more money on its own defense, but also on Ukraine, but it doesn't have the productive capacity. This is why Trump's potential election is so important, because if America stops supplying, Europe cannot make up the shortfall. Europe can't produce Patriot missiles or whatever. But Europe does have money. And I think one of the sort of the ways around it is also basically the Ukrainians will expect to have an accelerated entry into the EU as well. Whether they get it is maybe another matter, but certainly that's an expectation.
Yeah, but a Trump presidency is it's sort of D-Day for the Ukrainians. No, this guy thinks that he can somehow. I love this about this whole thing. I will get a ceasefire and then a peace agreement within 48 hours. Oh, okay, yeah. So you're not just going to get them to start talking, because they haven't even done that yet. You're going to get them to have found an agreement as well, right? It's difficult to get these.
Well, a ceasefire is not an agreement. It's just to stop the shooting. I mean,
no, I know, but the point I'm making is that you have to get dialogue initiated, and these two don't want to even talk. So, let alone some kind of product, i.e., a ceasefire or anything else. Like, it's delusional. Like, at what timescale could we remotely see a ceasefire were there a Trump presidency? I just don't see it. The guy doesn't have any. Emotion.
An interesting thing is, I don't think the Russians see it either. I mean, it's quite interesting that there's quite a bit of media commentary that more or less says, look, this is all nonsense. Yes, of course, they would much rather see Trump elected than Kamala Harris. But nonetheless, I think they are aware, like the rest of us, that there does tend to be something of a gulf between what Trump says and what Trump does. And indeed, first Trump presidency, for all his warm words about Putin, actually American policy towards Russia was tougher at the end of it than it had been at any point since 1991, to a large degree because Congress essentially took over control of policy, and Trump wasn't willing to spend political capital trying to do anything about it. So, yeah, I mean, we wait and see. I don't think the Russians are counting on the fact that Trump will indeed be able to impose a ceasefire. I think what they're counting on is precisely that as disruptor in chief, he will firstly not be interested in increasing any kind of supplies to Ukraine, and just secondly that the hard-fought unity within the West, which has been really quite striking, it has to be said, will begin to come under pressure, because in some ways that unity has been kept by avoiding the tough questions. Precisely, how does this end? What does victory look like? What does victory mean? What does defeat mean? We have avoided those in order to maintain our unity. In some ways, it'll be harder and harder to play that game, with Trump more or less saying, we're not going to be providing a blank check forever. So I think that's the risk. No, I mean, I cannot see, even if Trump is elected, I cannot see him being able to impose a ceasefire within 24 hours or 3 days or whatever he claims. Because, as you say, both sides are opposed. I think the Russians will be very happy to accept a ceasefire. But I think part of the reasons why the Ukrainians launched their Kursk operation was precisely to make a ceasefire less palatable to the Russians. Because basically, up to that point, a ceasefire just simply left the Russians in control of 20% of Ukraine. And then they would have, frankly, no incentive to reach any kind of real talks. They could just drag them out interminably until, as and when they were happy to restart the war. But frankly, they would have most of Novorossiya. But now, if they're going to play that game, they also have to accept that there is at least some small part of Russian territory which is indefinitely in Ukrainian hands. So I think that's part of the reason why the Ukrainians made that particular move.
All right, two more questions. One is this whole idea of Russian Balkanization, which obviously I think hardline pro-Ukrainian supporters who, as much as I understand how they feel, it's not going to happen, in my opinion. I don't think Russia's going to Balkanize. Sure, you could see a split away of Dagestan, Chechnya for the reasons you've mentioned before, but like sort of a breakdown of the entire Russian state? I mean, I just don't agree. And this whole idea that there's never really... we had... was it John Foreman or another gentleman, who's been the defense attaché to Russia up until most recently, and some other experts. I don't think it was him, but someone did say sort of there's never really been a true Russian identity. Were more parts of Kursk taken over and absorbed into Ukraine, annexed into Ukraine, the Russians would be like, all right, as long as I could go about doing my daily life, I don't really mind how I identify. Is that true? For one, and do you think really that a Russian Balkanization is ever such a thing because of such a big country being sort of like, bloated and can't function?
Yeah, no. I mean, the answer is there is a kind of Russian identity. In some ways, the same way as there was a Soviet identity. This is a funny thing. I remember, look, I mean, I'm sufficient of an old fart that I was doing my PhD when it was still the Soviet Union. I was there on and off, 1988 to 91. And it was really quite fascinating in those 3 years where basically the Soviet Union was collapsing, of actually how quickly, sort of around and after 1991, people reinvented themselves and said, well, I was never, I always saw through the whole Soviet sham and such like. They didn't. Many of them, most of them didn't. Most of them, however much they grumbled and complained and didn't like what was around them, they thought of themselves as Soviet citizens. They adapted to a post-Soviet existence. And likewise, there is a certain kind of Russian identity. It's not by any means perfect. It's much more problematic if you come from a non-Slavic, non-Russian Orthodox and so forth tradition. But beyond that, look, we have this is a country that's been shaped by centuries of not just conquest but also colonization. The intermingling of societies and cultures. Most of, for example, the notionally ethnic regions, Russians are either a majority or a plurality. You talk about, free Buryatia. Majority of people in Buryatia are Russians. They're not going to suddenly decide, we would quite like to become sort of, subsume ourselves within the Buryat identity or anything like that. The only real region which actually has both the economic capacity that it could be a state, as well as a sufficiently large critical mass of its own people, would be Tatarstan, which has oil. But an independent Tatarstan would be entirely surrounded by the Russian Federation. So one can wonder just how viable that would be. So basically, no. I mean, yes, I think there is an exception for with the North Caucasus that most Russians would regard as a boon if they could encourage it to leave. But beyond that, no, this is not going to fall apart.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think interesting you did your PhD in Moscow at that time. My father was completing his around. No, was he? Oh, it was around the crossover. He was in Moscow as well at that time.
Thank you so
Although
much for making me feel old, but there you go.
well, he's okay. Well, he was doing his. I think it was nuclear physicist or something, something like that, applied nuclear physics. But no, you don't look a day over 35, 40, I don't know, something. Pick a number. I'm sure it's. My last question for you, Mark, though, in this marathon, and I do appreciate your very generous time, but I think it's been a really well. I'm going to be listening to this myself every day, to make sure I absorb as much as possible, and I encourage other people to do the same. But where do we actually go with this? You said, what is the end game? Well, what is the end game, right? I'm not pretending that you have a crystal ball, and it's a bit of a generic question, but it's one that I think people like to talk about who don't follow this as ardently as we do. I've got different scenarios in my head. It becomes a frozen conflict, DMZ, like in North Korea. They never sign a peace deal. It's just an armistice or something. Do we get like a buffer zone with the UN and Cyprus? I don't think that that's happening now, given the how far the UN is stretched, but these are all radical scenarios people have proposed. Or does it just sort of fall into by the wayside? The Americans gradually do get pulled more to the Indo-Pacific as the Chinese ramp up the temperature on the Taiwanese, and ultimately the Ukrainians have to sort of develop their own industries and do what they can to minimize losses of territories. The Russians maybe just grind away incrementally.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that we are heading more towards a stalemate. I mean, it's a dynamic stalemate. The battle lines move back and forth, but that neither side is really going to be capable of delivering a kind of political knockout blow to the other. We're not going to see Russian tanks rolling into Kyiv. We're certainly not going to see Ukrainian tanks rolling into Moscow. And in that context, look, I think they will reach a point where, like two punch-drunk boxers hanging on the ropes, every now and then they could deliver a flurry of half-hearted blows, but frankly, they can't really do anything much. I think we will end up with a stalemate that sort of de facto freezes. So it's not necessarily going to be quite so structured as the Korean internal border now, but it might head that way. And I can't really see any dramatic change for a while. I mean, I think both sides will then need to kind of basically rebuild their forces. And we spend a lot of time thinking about the potential timeline for the Russians reconstituting their forces, which frankly is going to take, in my opinion, at least 8 years after the end of the active warfighting stage. And 8 years of basically spending at the current level. Remember, 40% next year, 40% of the Russian federal budget is going to be spent on defense and security.
Yeah.
They're going to have to continue to spend at that level if they want to rebuild. But also the Ukrainians are going to be rebuilding. And I think sort of one of the Russian potential strategic nightmares they're already thinking about is going back to what happened in Yugoslavia and Croatia's Operation Storm. That after, 4 or 5 years in which the Serbians had kind of created a pseudo-state of Krajina, then Croatia unleashed forces and a battle plan that had been working on for years and took the territory back. Now, again, I don't think necessarily we're thinking of all the occupied territories, but the point is, neither side is really going to be inconsequential. And it's hard to see how we move on, frankly, so long as Putin is in the Kremlin. I mean, I think this is for me is the kind of the tragedy. I think that he is locked into this position. I think he doesn't have another reinvention in him, and I don't think that we would accept any kind of return to a status quo ante under Putin. We could hope that mortality or coups or something else sort of changes the equation, but unfortunately, we might end up stuck in an essentially confrontational situation, which becomes more and more like the early Cold War. We talk about the Cold War, and we tend to think about the late Cold War, the sort of Brezhnev era, where, in a way, everyone had just understood the rules of the game, and we all accepted it, and we projected our conflicts out into the developing world and the global south, and so forth. This is more like the early Cold War, where the rules haven't really been defined. The Cold War of the Berlin blockade and airlift, for example. The Cold War leading up, in the period leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I think, actually, unfortunately, although I am sort of unfashionably optimistic about Russia in the long term, in the short to medium term, I think that we are going to face quite a volatile and dangerous situation in the east of Europe.
Why are you positive
What a
about
miserable way
Russia?
to come to an end.
No, let's focus on the positive then. And you said that it don't make you feel old, but you make me feel incredibly ignorant because I don't know much about the early Cold War. So there you go. You've got your historical wisdom for you. Why positive in the long term then? What, you think Russia could be reintegrated in? Well, that's too presumptuous of a Western.
I do think of Putin. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I see Putin very much as a kind of last gasp Homo Sovieticus. A man who hasn't really, and the circle around him as well, people who haven't really managed to kind of come to terms with the fact that Russia is no longer a global superpower, who look at what Russia has lost and have let that metastasize into kind of who took it from us. The next generation, they're not nicer people. I mean, on the whole, I look at the next political generations, and I see ruthless, opportunistic kleptocrats. And that's a good thing.
Right.
Because we in the West know how to deal with kleptocrats. We do it all the time. These are people who have an incentive to improve relations with the West for the most self-interested of reasons. And you can have rule of law without democracy. You can't have democracy without rule of law. I think that was one of the big mistakes that Russia made in the 1990s. And I think that the kleptocrat generation who will be taking over after Putin and the people of a sort of similar age, they're already thinking about succession planning. They're already thinking about how they sort of bequeath their business, criminal business empires to their kids, successors, or whatever. And they have an incentive to essentially bring in rule of law for the simple reason that when you've stolen everything, you then want that legitimated and protected through a legal system. And it's a classic robber baron trajectory. And in that context, I think they may well therefore bring in a certain degree of rule of law, again, for their own interests, particularly because they look at their pampered offspring and think that they could not battle for these assets the way they did in the 90s and the noughts. And, well, that provides a foundation. And then maybe the next political generation might be the democratizing generation. Or they might not. But I think these assumptions that somehow Russia is doomed to authoritarianism, that somehow its DNA has barbed wire within it, I think are very dangerous. Because I remember reading some stuff about, what people were saying about Germany in the 1930s as they saw Hitler's rise. And there's all sorts of contemporary accounts that says, well, of course, you look at Prussia and so forth, your German is just naturally militaristic, expansionistic, regards democracy as a weakness that is imposed by outsiders. And after World War II, admittedly, thanks to imposition of a constitution and martial aid, but Germany became a very different country. We don't quite want to actually also play the really longue durée things of how many, Viking nations became hyper woke Nordic European countries. But nonetheless, the point is that countries can and do change. And although Russia has missed many past opportunities, it doesn't mean that Russia has to. It may, but it doesn't mean that it has to miss the future ones.
Well, there you go. You wanted a more positive note to end on. I'm also very conscious of the fact that it's getting sort of like you're being swollen by the darkness as you've been talking for such a while. But yeah. Everyone, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, then give it a follow on Twitter or X or YouTube. And Mark, we'll have to have you back again. As I say, it won't be quite such a marathon next time. I've covered everything that I could possibly think of, at least as you say something. But it's been a real delight. And everyone, I always do consider subscribing on for more future content. And we've got many things coming up. I'm trying to hit from me. Mark Galeotti, and we'll see you all in the next one. Take care.